The room went cold before anyone said a word. I felt it first in my hands, a small tremble I tried to hide by folding them under the table. My name is Ethan Cole, and on that day I was sitting 3 seats behind Ambassador Grace Whitfield, holding a datapad nobody would ever ask me to read from. I was the youngest human in that chamber, and I had learned quickly that being young and human meant being invisible unless someone wanted to laugh at you. The Galactic Council chamber was shaped like a bowl of light, rings of seats rising around a central floor where the speakers stood. Every species had its own section, its own colors, its own smell of air pumped in just for them. Ours was the smallest section, tucked near the back, as if someone had added humanity to the room as an afterthought. That day, the afterthought was the topic of conversation. A delegate from the Threk Dominion stood at the center floor, tall and plated in dark blue armor that never seemed to leave his body, even in a room built for talking, not fighting. His name was Korthal, and he had a voice that carried without him raising it, the kind of voice built to be listened to. "Let us discuss the newest member of this council," he said, and I felt every human in the room straighten without meaning to. The species called humanity, 3 years among us, and what have they offered? No new technology, no new resources of value, no fleet worth mentioning. Laughter rippled through several sections. Not loud, not crude, just the quiet, confident laughter of people who believed they had already won an argument. I looked at Ambassador Whitfield. She did not move. She sat with her hands folded on the table, watching Korthal the way you might watch rain fall outside a window, mildly interested, not troubled. "They arrived here with wooden weapons compared to ours," Korthal continued, and this time the laughter grew louder. "They speak of history as though it means something. They speak of unity as though it is an achievement. I have seen insects with more coordinated colonies." More laughter. I felt my face grow hot. Beside me, a young aide from the Yulan delegation, a species with skin like brushed silver, leaned over and whispered, not unkindly, "You should say something back." "We don't," I whispered. "Why not?" I didn't have a good answer for her then. I only knew that in every meeting since we joined the council, our ambassador had followed one rule above all others: listen, record, do not react. It had felt, at times, like weakness. Sitting there that day, watching Korthal enjoy himself, it felt like something closer to shame. The speaker of the council, an elder being from the Farai species named Vesic, raised a thin hand for order, though I noticed she did not raise it with much urgency. The Farai were one of the oldest species in the council, older than most records could properly measure, and they had a habit of watching conflicts unfold rather than stopping them, the way a scientist watches a reaction in a sealed container. "Delegate Korthal," Vesic said, her voice dry as old paper. "You have made your point. Let the human delegation respond, if they wish." All eyes turned to our section. I felt my heart begin to hammer. Ambassador Whitfield rose slowly. She was not a tall woman, and she wore no armor, no ceremonial plating, nothing that marked her as anything other than what she was, a human being standing in a room full of people who thought that was the least impressive thing you could be. "Thank you, Speaker Vesic," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Delegate Korthal is correct that our fleet looks small next to the Threk Dominions." I heard a few surprised murmurs. She was agreeing with him. "He is also correct that we arrived here with less advanced weapons than most species in this chamber," she continued. "We do not deny any of this." Korthal's expression shifted, a flicker of confusion passing behind his otherwise confident posture. He had expected an argument, a defense, something to push against. Instead, he was being handed agreement, and it seemed to unsettle him more than any counterattack could have. "We would only add," Whitfield said, "that a great deal can happen in the space between what a species shows and what a species has. We are content to be underestimated for now. History has been kind to us in that regard." It was such a small thing to say. No threat in it, no anger, nothing that should have mattered. And yet I noticed something strange happen around the room. A few of the oldest delegates, particularly among the Farai, went very still. Speaker Vesik's eyes, usually half-closed with the boredom of centuries, opened fully for just a moment, fixed on Whitfield with an expression I could not name. Corthal laughed it off. "Poetic," he said, "but poetry does not build starships, Ambassador." "No," Whitfield agreed. "It doesn't." And she sat back down. That should have been the end of it. In any other meeting, it would have been. But Corthal, perhaps embarrassed that his mockery had not produced the reaction he wanted, could not let it go. "Since the humans are so confident in their hidden potential," he said, turning back to the speaker, "perhaps the council would enjoy a demonstration, a friendly exercise. Let the humans show us what lies beneath all this quiet dignity." The room's mood shifted instantly, sharpening into something eager, almost hungry. I understood, watching the faces around me, that many species in that chamber had grown tired of humanity's silence. They wanted a show. They wanted proof, one way or another, that the newest member of the council was either something to respect or something to dismiss forever. I looked at Whitfield again. She had not so much as blinked. "An exercise," Speaker Vesik repeated slowly, testing the word. "Explain." Corthal spread his hands, magnanimous, already savoring what he believed was a certain victory. A controlled fleet exercise. No lasting harm, of course. Simply a measure of capability. Let the humans field whatever ships they consider their best, against a Threk Dominion escort squadron. We will see, clearly and honestly, what humanity actually brings to this council. Murmurs of approval spread through several sections. Even a few of the more neutral delegates seemed intrigued, the way any crowd is intrigued by the promise of a contest. I felt sick. I had seen the specifications of Threk Dominion escort squadrons. I had seen ours. There was no version of that comparison that did not end in humiliation. I glanced at Whitfield, silently begging her to object, to find some diplomatic reason to decline. Instead, she stood again, unhurried, and said the words that would echo through every hallway of that station for weeks afterward. "We accept," she said, "on one condition." Corthal's smile widened. "Name it." "The exercise takes place in a system of our choosing," Whitfield said, "somewhere neutral, unclaimed by any council member, so no one can claim home advantage or foul play afterward." It seemed, on the surface, like a perfectly reasonable request. Corthal barely paused before agreeing, already picturing the story he would tell afterward, of the day the Threk Dominion proved once and for all what humanity truly was. "Agreed," he said. "Let the council record it. 3 cycles from now, in a system of humanity's choosing, we will show them, gently, what a mismatch looks like." The council chamber buzzed with anticipation as the session was adjourned. Delegates gathered in small groups, already placing quiet bets, already composing the stories they would tell their home governments. I stayed close to Whitfield as we walked out, waiting until we were alone in the corridor before I finally spoke. "Ambassador," I said, keeping my voice low, "why did you agree to that?" She glanced at me, and for the first time that day, I saw something in her eyes that was not calm patience, but something sharper, something almost amused. "Ethan," she said, "has anyone ever told you what happens when you let people underestimate you for exactly the right amount of time?" I shook my head. "They stop watching what you're actually doing," she said, "and they start watching what they expect to see instead. That gap, between the two, is the only advantage a small fleet has ever needed." I did not fully understand her then. I only knew that walking beside her, I felt the fear in my chest begin, very slowly, to change into something else, something that felt, strangely, like anticipation. Behind us, the chamber doors closed on a room still buzzing with laughter, delegates congratulating themselves on a decision they believed had already been made. None of them noticed that Whitfield had chosen the location. None of them thought to ask why a species with a fleet supposedly worth nothing would agree so readily to be tested. I noticed. I filed it away, the way she had taught me to file away everything, and I began, for the first time since joining the council, to feel something other than embarrassment when I thought about being human in that room. 3 cycles, Corthell had said. 3 cycles until the demonstration that was meant to end all questions about humanity, once and for all. None of us in that corridor knew yet just how right he would turn out to be, or how wrong he was about which direction the answer would point. The 3 cycles before the demonstration were the busiest I had ever seen the human delegation. I expected panic. I expected long nights of arguing over strategy, frantic messages to Earth, engineers scrambling to upgrade ships that everyone agreed were outmatched. Instead, I found something closer to quiet preparation, the kind of calm that comes from people who have already rehearsed for a moment like this many times before, even if I had never seen the rehearsal myself. Ambassador Whitfield spent most of those days in closed meetings with a woman I had only met once before, Captain Lucas Bennett, commander of the small human fleet stationed near the council border. He was not what I expected from a military officer. He spoke softly, smiled easily, and treated every question from junior staff, including mine, as though it deserved a full and thoughtful answer. "You're worried," he said to me, on the second day, as we walked through the observation deck of the station where I had been assigned temporary quarters. "That's fair. Most people are worried the first time they watch us prepare for something like this. The Threk escort squadron has triple our ship count," I said. "Their weapons are rated well above ours in every public specification sheet. I've read the numbers, Captain. I don't see how this ends without embarrassment." Bennett didn't argue with the numbers. That surprised me more than anything. "You're right," he said. "On paper, we lose badly. Then why did the ambassador agree to this?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the stars slide past the viewport, points of light that meant nothing to most species in the council, but had once meant everything to a species that spent centuries fighting each other before they ever left their own solar system. "Because paper isn't where battles happen," he said finally. "It's just where people who've never fought one imagine they do." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but he was already walking away, off to another meeting I wasn't invited to attend. Word of the demonstration spread quickly through the council station. What had started as a single moment of mockery in the chamber became the talk of every corridor, every dining hall, every diplomatic reception held in the days that followed. Delegates from a dozen species approached members of the human delegation, some out of genuine curiosity, some clearly hoping to witness a humiliation they could describe to their governments back home. A delegate from the Drask Trade Consortium, a species built low and wide with skin like cracked stone, cornered me near a refreshment table on the second evening. "You understand," he said, not unkindly, "that this will not go well for your people." "Maybe," I said, because I genuinely did not know how else to answer. The Threk Dominion built their military doctrine over 4 centuries of active conflict along 3 separate border regions, he continued, as though reciting from a report he had read many times. "Your species has existed as a spacefaring civilization for what, 60 years? 70? "About 80, I said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, if his species had laughs. 80 years. And you believe you can stand against ships and crews shaped by 4 centuries of war." I thought about Whitfield's words in the corridor, about the gap between what people expect to see and what is actually happening. I thought about Bennett's quiet confidence, the way he had agreed the numbers looked bad, and still walked away unworried. "I don't know what we believe," I told the Drask delegate honestly. "I only know our ambassador chose this fight. She didn't have to." He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his stone-colored eyes, before moving on to another conversation, another human aide to interrogate, another piece of gossip to carry back to his own delegation. Corthell, meanwhile, seemed to be enjoying himself more with each passing day. I saw him twice more before the demonstration, always surrounded by a small crowd of Threk officers and admiring delegates from other species, eager to align themselves with what they assumed would be the winning side. He made no effort to hide his confidence, and in some strange way, I respected that. He was not cruel out of calculation. He simply believed, completely and sincerely, that humanity was exactly as weak as it appeared, and he intended to prove it in front of the entire council as a kindness, a clarifying lesson delivered so that no one would waste further time debating our relevance. "Do not take this personally, young one," he told me once, when our paths crossed near the docking bays. He had clearly forgotten, or never bothered to learn, my name. "This exercise will save your species much wasted effort. Once the council sees clearly what you are, you can settle into whatever small role suits you, and stop pretending otherwise." "That's generous of you," I said, and I meant it to sound sharper than it came out, but he only smiled, taking my words as agreement rather than the bitterness I intended. The system chosen for the demonstration was a quiet, unclaimed stretch of space, known in council records only by a designation number, 3 jumps from the station, empty of any settled world, notable only for a dense field of asteroid clusters and a single dim star that gave the whole system a permanent, dusky twilight. I had assumed Whitfield picked it at random, simply to satisfy the condition of neutrality she had demanded in the chamber. It was only much later that I understood how deliberately every detail of that choice had been made. 2 days before the exercise, I was finally allowed into one of the planning sessions, more as an observer than a participant, seated quietly at the back of a room aboard the human command vessel, while Bennett briefed a handful of senior officers. A holographic display filled the center of the room, showing the asteroid field in detailed relief, along with projected positions for both fleets. "The Threk will arrange their formation the way they always do," Bennett said, tracing a line across the display with one finger. "Wide, aggressive spacing, designed to intimidate and to bring maximum firepower to bear quickly. It's worked for them for centuries, against species that fight the way they expect species to fight." "And we don't fight that way," said an officer near the front, a woman named Charlotte Bishop, whose calm authority reminded me strongly of Whitfield's own. "We never have," Bennett said. "Humanity spent most of its history fighting itself, in small spaces, against enemies who knew our language, our terrain, our habits. We learned a long time ago that the side with more ships doesn't always win. The side that understands the ground wins." "There is no ground in space," someone pointed out. Bennett smiled. "There's always ground, Ensign. You just have to know where to look for it." He gestured, and the holographic display shifted, highlighting the dense asteroid clusters scattered throughout the system. "This field isn't just scenery. It's terrain, sensor interference, unpredictable debris, tight maneuvering corridors that reward small, coordinated groups over large, rigid formations. The Threk will bring superior firepower and superior numbers. We're going to bring superior use of the space between us." I sat quietly at the back of the room, watching officer after officer nod along, watching maps and formations shift and adjust across the display, and I began to understand, slowly, that everything about this demonstration, from the location Whitfield had chosen to the ships Bennett was selecting, had been planned with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with decades, perhaps centuries, of hard lessons humanity had learned about surviving against stronger opponents. "There is one more thing," Whitfield said, arriving partway through the briefing, her presence quieting the room instantly. "I want to be absolutely clear with everyone in this room. This exercise is not about winning by causing harm. Korthal agreed to a demonstration, not a battle. We are going to show the Council exactly what they asked to see, nothing more." "Define exactly what they asked to see," Bennett said, a small smile at the corner of his mouth. "They asked whether humanity has anything worth respecting," Whitfield said. "We're going to answer that question so clearly that no one in that chamber ever asks it again." The room grew quiet at that, and I felt something shift in the air, a kind of shared resolve passing silently between officers who had clearly worked together for years, who trusted each other in ways that went beyond simple orders and procedure. On the final evening before the exercise, I found myself back on the observation deck, unable to sleep, staring out at the same stars Bennett and I had watched together 2 days earlier. Ambassador Whitfield found me there, standing quietly for a while before speaking. "You're still worried," she said. "A little less than before," I admitted. "But yes." She stood beside me at the viewport, her reflection faint against the glass. "Do you know why the fair eye went so quiet, back in the chamber, when I spoke about the gap between what a species shows and what it has?" I shook my head. "Because they remember older stories than most species in that council care to recall," she said. "Stories about civilizations that stayed quiet for a long time, not because they were weak, but because they understood something about patience that louder species tend to forget. The fair eye have survived longer than almost anyone. They know exactly what quiet can mean, when it isn't the same thing as harmless." "Is that what we are?" I asked. "Quiet, but not harmless?" Whitfield considered the question for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. "Tomorrow," she said, "the whole council finds out the answer to that question at the exact same time you do." She left me alone on the observation deck after that, and I stood there for a long while, watching the stars, thinking about 80 years of human spaceflight set against 4 centuries of threat conflict, about asteroid fields chosen with quiet precision, about an ambassador who agreed to humiliation with a calm that had nothing to do with weakness. For the first time since arriving at that station, I found myself looking forward to what tomorrow would bring, rather than dreading it. The observation deck of the council station had been converted, for the occasion, into something closer to a theater. Rows of seating had been arranged facing a wide bank of view screens, each one linked to a different sensor buoy scattered throughout the designated system, giving every delegate a full view of the exercise from multiple angles. I sat near the back, beside a nervous young member of our engineering staff named Oliver Grant, both of us gripping the edges of our seats long before anything had actually begun. The chamber filled quickly. Corthell arrived early, seated near the front with several senior Threk officers, already accepting quiet congratulations from delegates who had clearly already decided how the exercise would end. Speaker Vesic took her place at the highest point of the seating, flanked by 2 other elder Ferai, their expressions unreadable as always. Ambassador Whitfield sat near the front as well, not far from Corthell, calm in a way that made the tension in the room feel almost unfair to her, as though she alone had been given advanced knowledge the rest of us lacked. "Fleets are in position," announced the neutral observer overseeing the exercise, a small, gray-skinned official from a species with no stake in the outcome. "Beginning transmission from the exercise zone." The main view screen lit up, showing the dim, dust-lit system where both fleets waited. On one side, the Threk Dominion escort squadron spread wide across open space, exactly as Bennett had predicted, 18 ships arranged in an aggressive formation designed to overwhelm anything unfortunate enough to face them. Their hulls gleamed dark blue under the weak starlight, weapons already charged and visible along their forward sections. On the other side, 7 human ships sat clustered near the edge of the asteroid field, smaller, plainer, without the same aggressive posture. A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the observation deck at the size difference alone. 7 against 18, someone murmured behind me. "This will not take long." The exercise began with a formal signal from the neutral observer, and the Threk fleet moved first, advancing in that same wide, confident formation, clearly intending to close the distance quickly and bring overwhelming firepower to bear before the human ships could react. The human fleet did not retreat and did not advance to meet them directly. Instead, they split, 4 ships peeling away toward the dense heart of the asteroid field, while 3 others held position at the field's edge, weapons still dark, engines idling. "They're running," Corthell said loudly, his voice carrying easily across the observation deck, drawing laughter from several sections. Exactly as expected. I watched Whitfield's face on a smaller side screen, catching her expression from an angle. She did not react to the laughter at all. The Threk fleet pursued the retreating human ships into the asteroid field, their wide formation narrowing slightly as they entered the denser cluster of rock and debris, sensors clearly struggling against the interference Bennett had described. I watched their ship spacing compress, watched their weapons track and lose targets, track and lose them again, as the 4 human ships wove through narrow corridors between tumbling asteroids with a precision that looked almost rehearsed, because, I realized, it was. Then the 3 human ships that had held position at the field's edge began to move. They did not charge forward the way the Threk had expected. Instead, they slid sideways along the field's outer boundary, using the asteroid clusters as cover, angling toward the flank of the pursuing Threk formation, which was now stretched thin and disorganized as it chased shadows through the debris. "What are they doing?" someone behind me whispered, no longer laughing. I understood before the answer appeared on screen. The 4 fleeing human ships had never been retreating. They had been leading the Threk fleet into a trap shaped entirely by terrain, drawing 18 ships into a formation that could not maneuver quickly enough to respond when the remaining 3 ships struck from an unexpected angle, disabling weapon arrays and engine sections with precise, targeted fire that avoided anything close to a lethal strike. The observation deck fell silent as the exercise unfolded. One by one, Threk ships found themselves boxed in, unable to bring their superior firepower to bear against smaller, faster targets that seemed to know exactly where every asteroid, every debris field, every blind spot in their sensors would be. The 4 ships that had appeared to flee reversed course sharply, closing the trap from the opposite direction, catching the Threk formation between 2 coordinated groups that moved with an understanding of the terrain no outside observer could have anticipated. Within minutes, more than half the Threk escort squadron reported critical system failures. Ships that had entered the field with weapons charged and confidence high now drifted, powerless, their crews unharmed but their vessels completely disabled, surrounded by human ships that had never once needed to fire a shot capable of causing lasting damage. Korthal rose from his seat, his composure finally cracking. "This is impossible," he said, loud enough for the entire observation deck to hear. "Recheck the sensor feeds. There must be an error." The neutral observer, still monitoring the exercise from a console near the front, shook his head slowly. "There is no error, Delegate Korthal. The exercise data is confirmed across all sensor buoys. 12 of your 18 ships report full system disablement. The remaining 6 have withdrawn from the engagement zone, as agreed under the exercise terms." A heavy silence settled over the observation deck, broken only by the quiet hum of the view screen still displaying the aftermath. Disabled Threk ships drifting silently among the asteroid field, human ships holding steady positions around them, weapons never having escalated beyond what the demonstration required. I looked toward Speaker Vesic, sitting high above the rest of the chamber. Her expression had not changed throughout the entire exercise, but something in her posture seemed different now, a stillness that felt less like boredom and more like recognition. "Ambassador Whitfield," Vesic said, her voice cutting cleanly through the silence. "Would you care to explain what the Council has just witnessed?" Whitfield rose from her seat, unhurried, exactly as she had in the chamber days earlier. "A demonstration, Speaker Vesic," she said. "Exactly as requested. Delegate Korthal asked what humanity brings to this council. I believe the exercise data answers that question clearly enough. Your fleet was outnumbered more than 2 to 1, Vesic said, and yet no human ship required significant repair, while the majority of the Threk escort squadron has been disabled without a single fatality reported on either side." "Yes," Whitfield said simply. "How?" Vesic asked, and for the first time since I had joined the council, I heard something in an elder Farai's voice that sounded almost like curiosity rather than detached observation. Whitfield glanced briefly toward Korthal before answering, and though her tone remained gentle, her words landed with a weight that silenced the last of the murmuring throughout the observation deck. "Humanity spent most of its recorded history fighting itself," she said, "long before we ever reached the stars. We learned, over many painful centuries, that strength on paper rarely decides who survives a conflict. What decides it, far more often, is who understands the terrain, who adapts fastest, and who is willing to be patient enough to let an opponent's confidence become their weakness." She paused, letting her words settle across the chamber before continuing. We did not come to this council to prove ourselves through spectacle. We came quietly, because we understand something that many species in this room seem to have forgotten. Being underestimated is not an insult. It is very often the safest place a species can occupy, right up until the moment it chooses not to be. Korthal said nothing. He remained standing near the front of the observation deck, staring at the view screen still displaying his disabled fleet, his earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. Speaker Vesic studied Whitfield for a long moment, and then, slowly, she inclined her head, a gesture I had never seen an elder Farai offer to any species during my time on the council. "It appears," Vesic said, addressing the wider chamber, "that this council has learned considerably more today than it intended to." The observation deck remained silent as the session was formally closed. Delegates filing out in small, quiet groups. None of the earlier laughter or confidence anywhere to be found. I sat for a long moment after most of the chamber had emptied, watching the final view screen images of disabled Threx ships drifting peacefully among the asteroids, and I understood, finally, exactly what Whitfield had meant on the observation deck the night before. The gap between what a species shows and what a species has, I realized had just closed entirely. For every delegate who had gathered that day expecting to watch humanity humiliated, and had instead watched something far more difficult for any of them to forget. In the days that followed the exercise, the council station felt like a different place entirely. The easy laughter that had once followed our delegation through every corridor was gone, replaced by something quieter, more careful, though not yet fully trusting. I noticed it first in small things, the way conversations paused slightly when a human delegate entered a room, the way delegates who had once ignored us now watched us with open curiosity. I was walking through the lower promenade of the station, 3 days after the demonstration, when a young aide from the Yulan delegation, the same silver-skinned woman who had once told me to speak up during Korthal's Mockery, fell into step beside me. "Everyone is talking about it," she said. "The whole station. Some of the older delegates say they haven't seen anything like it in centuries." "Seen what, exactly?" I asked. "A species choosing to be underestimated," she said, "on purpose, for that long." I thought about how to answer her, remembering Whitfield's words about patience, about the gap between appearance and reality. "We didn't choose it to deceive anyone," I said. "We chose it because it kept us safe, while we learned enough about this council to know who we could trust." She studied me for a moment, something thoughtful behind her expression. "And now that everyone knows what you actually are. Now, I suppose, we get to stop pretending we're something smaller than we are," I said, and found, somewhat to my surprise, that saying it out loud felt like relief rather than pride. Later that evening, I overheard a conversation that would stay with me for the rest of my time on the council. I had been sent to deliver a message to one of the senior Farai advisors, and I arrived outside her private quarters just as 2 elder Farai were finishing a conversation of their own, their voices carrying faintly through a door not fully closed. "You remember the old records," one voice said, low and thoughtful. "The ones from before the Council's current era, describing species that vanished from galactic awareness for long stretches of time, only to reappear later, transformed." "I remember," the second voice replied. "Most delegates today dismiss those records as exaggeration, ancient propaganda, or poorly translated myth. And yet here we are," the first voice said, "watching a species behave in precisely the pattern those records describe. Quiet, patient, allowing itself to be dismissed, right up until dismissal becomes dangerous for everyone involved. You believe humanity fits that pattern." "I believe," the first voice said, "that we should stop assuming every young species arrives at this council with nothing to teach us, simply because they arrive with less to show us." I did not linger to hear more, understanding that I had already overheard something not meant for me, but I carried that conversation with me for the rest of the evening, turning it over in my mind alongside everything I had witnessed during the exercise. 2 days later, I was called into a private meeting alongside Ambassador Whitfield, Captain Bennett, and, unexpectedly, Speaker Vesic herself. The meeting took place in a small, quiet chamber near the top of the station, away from the noise and speculation still filling the lower levels. "I asked for this meeting privately," Vesic said, once we were all seated, "because I believe the council chamber is not always the best place for honest conversation. Too many delegates listening for advantage, too few listening for understanding." "We're grateful for the invitation, Speaker Vesic," Whitfield said. "I do not doubt that your fleet performed exactly as intended during the exercise," Vesic continued. "What I would like to understand, Ambassador, is why humanity chose restraint for so long, when a demonstration of this capability might have earned you a stronger position within this council far sooner." Whitfield considered the question carefully before answering. "Because capability, shown too early to a council still deciding whether to trust us, tends to look like a threat rather than a strength," she said. "We have learned, across our own history, that new arrivals who show strength before they show restraint are rarely given the benefit of the doubt. We wanted this council to know our patience before it learned our capability, in that order and not the other way around." "A careful strategy," Vesic said, "born, I suspect, from painful experience." "Very painful experience," Whitfield agreed. "Humanity spent a great deal of its history assuming the worst of each other, long before we ever had the chance to consider other species at all. We fought wars across our own small world for reasons that seem, in hindsight, difficult to justify. We came close, more than once, to losing everything we had built, through conflicts entirely of our own making. And this taught you patience," Vesic said. "It taught us the cost of impatience," Whitfield corrected gently. "There's a difference. We are not patient because it comes naturally to us, Speaker Vesic. We are patient because we remember, very clearly, what happens when we aren't." Vesic was quiet for a long moment, her ancient eyes studying Whitfield with an intensity I had not seen from her before. "The Farai have existed long enough to remember species who forgot that lesson entirely," she said finally. "Species who mistook their own strength for permission to act without restraint. Very few of those species remain part of this council today." "We're aware of the history, Speaker Vesic," Whitfield said quietly. "It's part of why we came here so carefully." Captain Bennett, who had remained silent for most of the conversation, spoke up then, his voice steady. "I'd like to add something, if I may, Speaker Vesic." Vesic nodded for him to continue. "The exercise 3 days ago was designed specifically to avoid harm," Bennett said. "Every tactic we used, every maneuver, was chosen to disable rather than destroy. That wasn't only a matter of following the exercise terms. It reflects how we prefer to operate whenever a situation allows for it. We understand our own capability well enough to know exactly how much force a given moment requires, and we make every effort not to exceed it." "A valuable discipline," Vesic said. "One this council does not always practice as carefully as it should." "We don't claim to be perfect at it," Bennett said, "only that we take it seriously. We would rather be known, going forward, for how carefully we use strength than for how much strength we possess." Vesic studied each of us in turn before finally speaking again. "I will be direct with you, Ambassador Whitfield. Captain Bennett, this council has, historically, been slow to extend genuine respect to newer species, particularly those who arrive without dramatic displays of power. Delegate Corthal's Mockery, while regrettable in its execution, reflected an attitude shared, quietly, by a great many delegates in that chamber." "We're aware," Whitfield said, without bitterness. "What you demonstrated 3 days ago," Vesic continued, "was not simply military capability. It was restraint, patience, and an understanding of consequence that many species considerably older than yours have never fully learned. That, Ambassador, is a rarer thing to witness in this council than raw strength alone." I sat quietly through the remainder of the meeting, listening as Vesic outlined, carefully and deliberately, the beginning of what would become significant shifts in how the council approached its relationship with humanity. Shifts that would ripple outward into trade agreements, defense considerations, and diplomatic protocol over the following weeks. But it was that single exchange, the the quiet acknowledgement between Vesic and Whitfield that stayed with me most clearly. As we left the meeting that evening, walking together through the quiet upper corridors of the station, I finally asked Whitfield the question that had been building in me since the exercise. "Were you ever worried," I asked, "that it wouldn't work? That the plan might fail, and we'd end up exactly as humiliated as everyone expected?" Whitfield considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I was worried about many things, Ethan," she said. "I was worried about miscalculating the asteroid field's interference patterns. I was worried about Threk reinforcements arriving unexpectedly. I was worried about a dozen small details that could have gone wrong in 100 different ways. But not about whether we could win. We were never trying to win in the way Korthal imagined winning," she said. "We were trying to be understood. There's a difference, and it's a difference this council is only beginning to learn about us." We walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, past delegates who nodded to us now with expressions far more careful than the dismissive glances I had grown used to during my early days on the council. Something had shifted, clearly and permanently, in the way humanity was seen within those halls, though I understood, even then, that the deeper work of building genuine trust had only just begun. The formal session held 1 week after the exercise was unlike any council gathering I had attended before. The chamber was full, every section occupied, delegates arriving early, none of the casual lateness that usually marked ordinary sessions. Word had spread across every corner of council space by then, carried through diplomatic channels, trade networks, and the kind of quiet gossip that moves faster than any official report ever could. I sat in my usual place behind Ambassador Whitfield, though I noticed, this time, that several delegates from neighboring sections had positioned themselves closer to our seating than they ever had before, as though proximity to humanity had suddenly become something worth arranging. Speaker Vesic opened the session with unusual formality, her voice carrying clearly across the chamber. "Before we proceed to today's scheduled matters, the Council will hear a formal statement from the Threk Dominion delegation." Korthal rose from his seat, and I noticed immediately how different he looked from the confident figure who had stood in that same chamber weeks earlier. His posture remained proud, as befit his station, but something in his expression had changed, a seriousness that had not been there before. "Speaker Vesic, honored delegates," he began, "the Threk Dominion wishes to address recent events involving the human delegation." The chamber fell silent, every delegate listening closely. "3 weeks ago, in this very chamber, I spoke of humanity in terms that I now recognize were both premature and disrespectful," Korthal said. "I based my judgment on incomplete information and an assumption that a species' worth could be measured entirely by the strength it chooses to display, rather than the strength it chooses to withhold." I glanced at Whitfield, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though I thought I caught the faintest softening around her eyes. "The demonstration our delegation requested was intended to settle a question I believed already answered," Korthal continued. "Instead, it answered a different question entirely, one I had not thought to ask, namely, whether the Threk Dominion has been too quick, in recent generations, to measure other species solely by the standards of our own history and our own methods of conflict." He paused, and the chamber remained utterly still, waiting. "On behalf of the Threk Dominion, I offer a formal apology to the human delegation, and to Ambassador Whitfield personally, for the tone and manner of my earlier remarks," he said. "We recognize now that humanity's caution was never a sign of weakness, but a sign of wisdom this council would do well to study more carefully." Ambassador Whitfield rose to respond, her voice calm and without any trace of triumph. "Delegate Korthal, your apology is received and appreciated. Humanity does not hold grudges over honest misunderstanding, particularly when that misunderstanding is corrected with the same honesty it began with." A quiet murmur of approval passed through the chamber, and I noticed several delegates from other sections nodding along, clearly relieved that the tension of the past weeks had found a graceful resolution rather than a lasting rift. What followed, over the subsequent weeks, was a shift in humanity's standing within the council that none of us had fully anticipated. Not even Whitfield, who had planned so carefully for so long. Delegations that had previously ignored our section entirely began requesting private meetings, eager to establish trade agreements, defense cooperation, and diplomatic ties they had never considered worth pursuing before. The Yulan delegation, whose young aide had first encouraged me to speak up during Korthal's Mockery, requested one of the earliest meetings, proposing a modest trade agreement involving shared technology for long-range communication, a field in which their species had always excelled. I sat in on that meeting as well, and found myself, for the first time, treated not as an invisible junior aide, but as a genuine participant in the conversation. "We should have approached your delegation months ago," the senior Yulan representative admitted candidly, during a pause in negotiations. "We allowed the loudest voices in this council to shape our assumptions about your species, rather than forming our own judgment." "Most delegations did the same," Whitfield said, without any bitterness in her tone. "We understood that, and prepared for it. It's part of why we chose patience over protest." Even the Drask Trade Consortium, whose delegate had once cornered me near a refreshment table to explain, patiently and thoroughly, why humanity stood no chance in the coming exercise, approached our delegation within the month, proposing an expanded trade route that would benefit both our peoples considerably. "I said several things to you before the exercise that I now regret," the same stone-skinned delegate admitted to me privately during a reception held to celebrate the new trade agreement. "I based my judgment entirely on numbers, without considering how those numbers might be used." "You weren't wrong about the numbers," I told him honestly. "Our fleet really was outnumbered. Our weapons really were less advanced. You just assumed those numbers told the whole story." "A mistake I will be more careful not to repeat," he said, and I believed him. Perhaps the most significant change came several weeks later, during a private conversation between Ambassador Whitfield and Speaker Vesic, one I was fortunate enough to witness firsthand, having been asked to attend as part of my ongoing training within the delegation. "The Council has decided," Vesic said, "to formally review its protocols regarding the assessment of new member species. Going forward, evaluations will place considerably greater weight on demonstrated restraint and adaptability, rather than raw military capability alone." "That's a meaningful change, Speaker Vesic," Whitfield said. "It is a change your delegation's actions made necessary," Vesic replied. "This council has existed for a very long time, Ambassador. We had grown comfortable in certain assumptions about how new species ought to present themselves, and what that presentation should tell us about their worth. Humanity has reminded us, quite thoroughly, that those assumptions were never as reliable as we believed." I thought back, during that conversation, to my earliest days on the council, sitting quietly behind Whitfield, while delegates from a dozen species laughed openly at everything humanity represented. I thought about the shame I had felt then, the desire to argue back, to defend our species loudly against every insult thrown our way. I understood now, far more clearly than I had at the time, why Whitfield had chosen silence instead, and how much strength that silence had actually contained. Months after the exercise, walking through the same corridors where delegates had once dismissed our section entirely, I found myself greeted differently at every turn. Officials nodded respectfully. Delegates from species who had never bothered learning a single human name now greeted me by mine. The mockery that had once followed humanity through every hallway of that station had been replaced, almost entirely, by a careful, curious respect that felt, at times, stranger to adjust to than the earlier dismissal had ever been. I asked Whitfield once, during a quiet evening near the end of my first full year on the council, whether she had ever expected things to change so completely, so quickly. "I expected it to change eventually," she said. "I didn't necessarily expect it to happen all at once, the way it did. Sometimes a single moment carries more weight than years of careful positioning ever could." "Do you think Korthal regrets what happened?" I asked. "I think Korthal learned something valuable," Whitfield said, "and learned it without any lasting harm done to anyone involved. That's about the best outcome any of us could have hoped for, given how the whole situation began." I considered her answer for a while watching the same stars I had watched with Captain Bennett months earlier, before the exercise that changed everything. "Do you think humanity wanted this?" I asked finally. "This respect, this attention, or did we just want to be left alone?" Whitfield smiled, the first truly unguarded smile I had seen from her in all my time serving beside her. "Humanity has never particularly wanted awe, Ethan," she said. "We've certainly never wanted fear. What we wanted, more than anything, was simply to be understood well enough that no one felt the need to test us the way Corthal did. Respect, if it comes at all, should come from understanding, not from a single demonstration in an asteroid field." "And if it takes more than one demonstration?" I asked. "If someone else decides to test us again, the way Corthal did?" Whitfield looked out at the stars for a long moment before answering, her voice steady and calm, carrying none of the anger such a question might have deserved. "Then we'll remind them, just as clearly and just as carefully as we reminded the Threk Dominion," she said. "Not because we want to prove anything, but because some lessons, once learned properly, tend to stay learned for a very long time." I stood beside her a while longer, watching the same quiet stars that had once felt so uncertain to me, and understood, finally, exactly what it meant to belong to a species that had learned, the hard way, exactly how to stay quiet, until the moment quiet was no longer the wisest choice available. The Galactic Council, in the months and years that followed, never again mistook humanity's silence for weakness. And every so often, in some quiet corner of that great chamber, I would notice an older delegate glance toward our section with something that looked very much like the careful respect reserved for old stories, the kind that everyone eventually learns are worth listening to closely, long before they ever get the chance to see them proven true.